When I got elected to council, homelessness was not the number one issue. Well, now you had a bunch of people getting elected, again, from the most conservative member to the most progressive member. They're running because of homelessness. The reason why we stay strong is we built the infrastructure. So, you take a foundation like Liberty Hill. Liberty Hill's helped build the infrastructure for organizations like Community Coalition. Community Coalition helps build the infrastructure for organizations like A New Way of Life. A New Way of Life helps build the motion to get ban the box motion passed in the state and to get voting rights. We now have a piece of legislation on the table in Sacramento that would give the voting rights to people the minute they leave prison, even if they're on probation. But all of that is because we have the infrastructure to support it. And if you build the infrastructure, Los Angeles is the kind of great place that attracts the talent. People are going to step into it.
Justice takes many forms and many hands. I'm Shane Murphy Goldsmith, President and CEO of Liberty Hill Foundation. I'd like to welcome you to Season 3 of Conversations from the Front Lines, where we tackle some of the most challenging social justice issues of the day with heart and honesty. This season, we're exploring the theme of igniting electoral power and defending our democracy. We've gathered some of LA's frontline political and community leaders to go behind the scenes of the fights for social change, the efforts to build community power, and the work to increase solidarity across movements. Get ready for some frank conversations and real talk on Conversations from the Front Lines. Today I'm joined by Los Angeles City Council President Pro Tem Marqueece Harris-Dawson for part 2 of our episode, moving from community-based campaigning to electoral power. Thanks so much for joining us today, Marqueece.
Good to be with you all. Thank you for having me.
All right, well, let's start off with you telling us what you're most fired up about right now.
Oh, wow. There's so much to be fired up about. We got a presidential candidate that sort of lit the fuse and got everybody fired up and interested in civic engagement. I felt it was a great resignation from political life, from not just progressives and social justice folks, from everybody, from every side of the spectrum. I didn't see that crazy debate that everyone talks about, but the reaction that I heard from people, I happen to be out of the country, the reaction I heard from everybody, whether they were right-wing, center, or liberal or progressive, it was just sad. The whole thing was just sad. And now I feel like we have something to be happy about, which opens up lots of other doors and makes everything else, you take a second look at everything else that's happening.
I love it. That's beautiful. Yeah, it was like a instantaneous change in the temperature.
Yep.
From, just sort of hopelessness to hopefulness and joy and fun.
I remember early in the year, someone had asked, was I going to Chicago? And I looked at them like, are you kidding me? Like, I would never dream of doing that. And then last week, I'm like, are there rooms still available in Chicago?
Well, I'm so glad you're with us today to talk about, I think, one of your and my favorite subjects, which is electoral power in Los Angeles. And I'd love to start with just letting our listeners get to know you a little bit and hear kind of what's your story? How did you become who you are today? And in particular, your kind of journey from community organizing to elected office. Love to hear that story.
Grew up in South LA in the 80s and some of the 70s and 80s. Lots of my friends' parents were activists or involved in political life, so it was always attractive to me. I went to Morehouse College in Atlanta, certainly produces a fair number of activists and elected officials, but activists especially. Came back and found Karen Bass and the Community Coalition and began working there and moved into the leadership of that organization. And from there, ran for LA City Council when the seat was open, and we were able to put together a victorious campaign. And we were able to demonstrate that you could turn community power or flip community power to express itself in a different way in the electoral space. And so Karen Bass had run before me, before her, Mark Ridley Thomas, Antonio Villaraigosa, Gil Cedillo, like they had all done that. Some of them were union organizers, some of them were community organizers, and they'd flipped it. And of course, there had been the big one, the monster, Barack Obama had done the same thing in Chicago. And so it was a model that we'd seen places and we wanted to test it out here in Los Angeles. And what's different about LA is it's one thing to get a one-off, it's one thing to like get a mayor or get a president or get a congressperson or get a council member. It's another thing to get critical mass. So our inside out strategy is really inside at every level, not just one insider that we all go to. I can remember as a young organizer, LA City Council, if you wanted something done, it was either your choices were Mark Ridley Thomas or Jackie Goldberg. Like that was it.
Oh my gosh.
And I mean, other people weren't against what you were doing, but they weren't gonna push it forward. Mike Hernandez too. Although I never worked with Mike Hernandez, but generally speaking, like that was it. And so moving into this phase, the idea is how do you get critical mass where the entire culture of the place changes?
Yes. And I want to talk more about exactly that. This is part two of a two-part episode. The first part was with Alberto Ortana, who you may know, is the President and CEO of Community Coalition.
Mm-hmm. I've met him once or twice. Yeah.
So I want to share some things that he said and would love to hear your thoughts on this. So one of the things he shared about Community Coalition, having himself been there now for a long time and succeeding you in the CEO role, is that he thinks one of the most powerful things about Community Coalition is that it really intentionally develops leaders over many, many years. And he certainly considers himself a product of that. And would love to hear kind of your version of that. I mean, you also rose up through the ranks.
Well, I think that's right. I think Mayor Bass really set in motion this idea that the next generation of activists was something we needed to do, something we needed to build, as opposed to waiting for it to happen or not happen. And so she set up the organization in a way that it did that in its membership. And so we have South Central Youth Empowered Through Action, whose members now are, I think the oldest of those members are in their maybe mid 40s. And they're playing all types of role in civic and public life.
Including on your staff, right?
Including on my staff. The person who just set up this Zoom, for example,
yes,
is one of those people. I have, I don't know, a handful of people from my team now. They're on the mayor's staff. They're on the staffs of other city council members that are not COCO people. They're the legislator. They're in the labor movement. They're in philanthropy. They're in academia. So that was done on purpose. And what you're seeing now is the sort of fruits that bears. And Coalition, I'm very proud of because they're trying to make that a permanent culture. Started by Karen. Well, we're two executive directors off of the founder now, and making sure that eventually there will be a set of people there that weren't around when Karen was around. And in fact, that's already the case. There are young staff there that only know Karen Bass as the congresswoman and the mayor. They don't know her as a community organizer.
Wow.
And so making sure that culture that she put in place stays and grows stronger.
That's amazing. It's so incredible to see all of that leadership development over so many years, such a strong institution in South LA. And, you mentioned also not only the culture of leadership at COCO, but the culture of City Hall and City Council. And I think folks probably didn't think a lot about that idea of the culture of City Hall until those racist audio tapes came out. And it's kind of like at least a slice of the culture on display. And I know you were very, very involved in dealing with the ramifications of that. But would love to hear just kind of your analysis of that culture, how, what it's changing from and to, and particularly now with, you've got you coming into the council presidency, you have Karen Bass as the mayor, and then you've got a solid number of progressive, not just progressive, but movement folks on the city council. So just love to hear that kind of story arc and what you're seeing.
Well, what's interesting is the council is a very different place than when I started. When I started on the council, whether it was progressive or moderate, we don't really have conservatives on the LA City Council. Almost everybody was from Sacramento. Like a majority of the members, not only were Sacramento politicians, they had served in Sacramento together. And so I think it was only me and Joe Buscaino who hadn't grown up working in the government in or around elected office, for most of our lives. And so there was a lot of, this is the way things have to be, and this is the way we do things. The nature of relationships is that they're transactional. A fair amount more than I was comfortable with competition amongst members or factions of members. And now, to me, even with the new members who are not progressives, their viewpoint about how to behave or how to get things done as an elected is just very different. I remember there would be big disagreements about someone would call me to interview me about a particular topic. And I'd be like, oh, yeah, here's the topic. And I'd get reamed by another member who's like, I brought that motion and I did that and I did this. And I was just like, bro, I was just trying to help out the reporter. And now there's a more egalitarian, more collaborative way because I think everybody realizes they can get more done together than they can get done in competition. Also, the problems we face are bigger. I mean, people find this hard to believe, but when I got elected to council, homelessness was not the number one issue. It just wasn't. It was becoming that, but it wasn't. And most people who ran for city council when I started, including me, land use was a major part of their platform. What goes in a neighborhood, what doesn't, so on and so forth. Well, now you had a bunch of people getting elected, again, from the most conservative member to the most progressive member. They're running because of homelessness. Like homelessness is the number one issue, and it's produced the vast majority of the new members that we see.
Oh my gosh, you just said so many interesting things that I want to dig into. Probably the most alarming thing you said, although maybe not surprising, is that we have bigger problems now. Of course, we're all hoping to go in the opposite direction. So I want to hear more about, why and how do we have worse problems now? And I wonder, I mean, you just kind of made this one point about folks were getting on the council because of land use and now homelessness. I mean, that actually, I wonder if there's a bit of a causal relationship there in terms of how folks are viewing land use and the commodification of land in Los Angeles and how that might have contributed to an acceleration of unhoused folks.
Well, there's no doubt our market, our real estate market, our land market, our housing market has produced the situation that we have now, right? So if we had a situation, and we sometimes have this, right, where people are lined up to get a particular product and the company doing it can't produce, or the industry producing the product can't keep up, we say, oh, there's a problem in this market and we need to do something to correct the market. Well, the same thing is true of housing. I love 10, 15, 20% returns every year on the house I own. It's wonderful, but that comes with a cost. And so the question becomes, how much does that cost and is it worth it? Clearly, people living on the street is not worth it. So that's the main issue. And also, once you let this problem get to the stage of homelessness, suddenly it isn't just a housing problem. It's also a mental health problem. It's also a crime problem. It's also a violence problem. Like it's a number of new problems metastasize based on having this situation. It's like when you let a puddle sit in your backyard. Over time, it's going to create other problems besides just the water in that little ditch. You're going to have mosquitoes in a minute. And the next thing you know, you're going to have a whole ecosystem around. And homelessness is no different. And so now you have the city council. We can't just talk about land use. We can't even just talk about building housing. We have to talk about services. We have to talk about mental health. We have to talk about transportation in ways that we didn't before.
Why do you think the culture is changing so much? I mean, I worked in City Hall for a number of years. I think describing it as transactional and competitive is very accurate. Why is it changing to be more collaborative and more, what other word did you use? Oh, egalitarian.
Two, but the vast nature of the problem, like the most conservative person knows, even if the city did everything I want, it's not going to solve homelessness. And frankly, the most progressive person knows that too. The most progressive person knows, like, I'm a strong advocate of care first. I'm generally against enforcement, but they also know there has to be some kind of something. Everybody knows that they need a little bit from the people that they don't agree with. And homelessness is big. Like everybody's looking at us like, what are you guys going to do? Are you guys going to solve this or not? As Governor Newsom said, and I had a lot of truck with what Governor Newsom said the other day, but this is the one thing I agree with him. It's like, if you can't solve this problem, you don't deserve to be in office. It doesn't matter if you're a progressive, a liberal, moderate, or a conservative. It just doesn't. We got to deal with this. And so that kind of pressure, I think, puts everybody in the same foxhole. And when you're in the same foxhole, you figure out ways to get along that you might not have figured out if you weren't in the foxhole.
And what do you think about the role of movement folks, movement organizations, advocacy organizations, and just kind of generally in terms of an issue that's this deeply rooted, that's this big? I mean, it's bigger time frame and scope than any elected term or than any elected body's power. So some might say that, movements are able to sort of be more long-term, more visionary, more root cause oriented, whereas elected folks kind of have to be in the emergency room triaging. What's your analysis of that?
Well, I think it's never one of one thing. It's almost always a mix of things. And so, there is triaging. I will say you raise a question that I can't sit here and tell you I have the answer to about how do social justice organizations interact with elected on the question of homelessness, because homelessness is a very difficult issue to organize around. Mm-hmm. because the people most affected, by definition, are not people who are easy to get a hold of because they have to move around, right? And they have to dedicate all of their energy to ending that condition. You know, you do student organizing or labor organizing, they're all at work. Student organizing, they're all at schools. Neighborhood organizing, they're all in the neighborhood. Homeless organizing is very, very different. And once your problem is solved, you're automatically not in the category, right? If I'm a student activist and we win ethnic studies, well, I'm still a student, right? And I can move on to the next issue. If I'm homeless and I get housed, I'm not homeless anymore. What makes me the constituency goes away. So it's a very tricky issue. And I think, LA Can certainly does a great job. I see some of a lot of our organizations, SAGE, people in the Unidad Coalition, struggling around housing. Coco, Scope, Lane have opened up new fronts around housing. None of it has hit the issue, I think, in a square and holistic way. And maybe it never gets that way. Maybe we're in a permanent situation where everybody's taking off a bite at a time. It is perplexing and vexing how unruly the issue of homelessness is.
And you mentioned crime and violence and certainly criminalization once folks become unhoused. I know you've done a ton of work on public safety. We got to work together a little bit when I was on the police commission on those issues. And I know you've recently got some real traction on what I think people might not realize is a quite radical proposal around, let me get it right, alternative transit enforcement.
We never say it's radical.
I know. I'm sorry. I'm totally ruining your whole thing. Between you and me and our millions of listeners. Mm-hmm. I mean, the reason I think it's radical is because I've been inside that system. And actually, I remember speaking to you before I joined the police commission, and you were already, talking about this proposal. And that was, 8 more years ago. Mm-hmm. And at the time that you mentioned it, I thought, like, that seems, of course, why wouldn't we do that? What could possibly get in the way of that? It's a great idea. And then I got in the police system and I realized, like, it's like blasphemy. I mean, you're cutting to the core of their beliefs and their strategies. So it may seem straightforward to kind of regular folks, but how are you moving that through the system and why?
Look, I didn't know when I talked to you about this 8 years ago, or it might have been longer. I've been thinking about this since I was at Coco, mainly because generally speaking, whenever there was a problem that I had with law enforcement or any of our constituency had with law enforcement, it originated in a traffic stop. And the ostensible reason for them stopping you did not require them to have a deadly weapon. They didn't need the option of killing you to tell you your blinker was broken or you crossed a double yellow line. They just didn't need it. And yet we seem to insist on doing that. The George Floyd situation made everybody ask, okay, what can we do and what can we do that's meaningful? And I said, I have something. And so, we were ready for that. And, we've tried to build, that was a situation where as an elected official, I got out ahead of the organizing. And so we had to go back and say, hey guys, by the way, I just proposed this really big, hairy, scary thing. It'd be great if we could all get behind it. And folks have stepped up. Advancement Project, Community Coalition, the Stops Coalition has done that. And so we're excited. This addiction to violence that the United States has and the addiction to the use of force is, to me, most grotesquely expressed in traffic stops. There's no need for the person who's citing me for a traffic violation to have the option of killing me any more than the mailman needs that, the librarian, the teller at the grocery store, the person at the tax collecting desk. You ever had to go pay your taxes in person?
No, sir.
It is not a pleasant experience at all. I'm just telling you, I'm sure they're lovely people outside of their job. Not fun when you're there to do it. Almost everyone gets into some type of dispute. The teller doesn't ever have to pull out a gun and shoot somebody. So I just want to have that argument, have that debate. And in what I think is one of the greatest, it's one of the ways in which there is unity for every Black person, no matter what your walk of life. So Tim Scott is a right-wing Republican senator from South Carolina, and he can tell you about traffic stops. He can tell you about getting stopped going into trying to go to Congress. And he was an elected member of the United States Senate. And the most radical revolutionary can tell you that story. And so that is unity. It is one of the ways in which racism and white supremacy expresses itself in a material and very frankly frightening and unsettling way that I think we have the capacity to end. And I think Los Angeles is the only place and the best place to start that trend.
And how do you see that relating to folks who are living on the streets and the use of law enforcement in those types of interactions, which...
Well, that's just it. I mean, part of what happens in the government, part of what I learned in the government, it is part of what we've done among progressives is we say, oh, people want to criminalize people. And there's certainly some truth to that. And I wouldn't even word it that way. What I would say is there are some people who want consequences to every action. And they're just stuck there. All of us have someone like that in their families, right? Where you didn't make your bed, you don't get dessert. Like there has to be consequences, right? So there are people that focus on that, right? So that's true. That's what I would call the criminalization crowd. But you know what mostly happens in big cities? And Los Angeles is no different. When you want to solve a problem, you look at the tools that are in front of you. And guess what we have a lot of? Police. They're the only city resource that's available, except for DWP. And even with DWP, you got to produce a downed wire or a water main break. You can get them in the middle of the night. You can get them on the weekend, or if you have a fire. Other than that, the only public service that you can produce on demand is police. So when you have something that's very serious that you need done quick, you go to what you have.
Yep.
One of my political science teachers put it the best when he said, which I didn't understand it at the time. I understand it much better now. He's like, when all you have is hammers, everything looks like a nail. Everything looks like a nail, even if it's not a nail. You do that, you've got to build the infrastructure. And so that's why I'm excited about people like Eunices Hernandez and Bob Blumenfield and others who are doing the work brick by brick, program by program, building alternative response models. So we're trying to build an alternative for traffic safety. They're trying to build alternatives for mental health, for other crises that don't need somebody with a gun, right, but moreover needs people with particular training. So if I'm looking at a mental health problems, I've lost track of the number of cops who told me
they don't want to do that.
Right. This person is not doing anything illegal or wrong, but clearly they need help. I don't have the capacity to help them. And there's nobody I can call to say, hey, I'm, Joe the policeman. I got this person that needs help. Can you come? So we have to build those systems. And that's what's happening in Los Angeles right now. And it's extremely exciting. Whether we have a good foundation with our gang reduction, youth development, the GRID program, our community intervention workers already do this kind of work. We have the Circle program. We've got the PED teams. We've got medical transport response. There's a host of things that we're trying. And as they show promise, we'll scale them up and scale them up. And eventually, and I'd like to see this before I leave the council, when you see a situation, you're going to have more people to talk to than police and fire.
Mm. Yeah, it makes me think of this experience I had a number of years ago with one of the people I love most in all the world, who I won't name, but he was going through a mental health crisis. And the only option he could think of for getting any kind of mental health care was to call the police and say he threatened to jump off a bridge. He had to be very specific about his plan for suicide. And if he did that, police would come 5150. He'd at least get 72 hours in lockup and some potential support and maybe hospitalization. But that's where folks find themselves.
And that's ridiculous. In the African-American community, what you're describing is particularly acute because in that situation,
terrifying.
Our families don't even want to do that because you know what?
It could be much worse.
Yeah. The cop might end up killing the person. So even that option is not even on the table to say, let me get committed so I can get some medical attention. You don't even have that. And so we got to get to the point where when that's happening, I don't know how many families I talk to who say like, I need some help, but I don't need it to be that. I need it to be actually help. I don't need it to escalate the situation. I actually need it to de-escalate the situation. So part of that is a broader problem with policing. It's an unreasonable expectation with the kind of training that officers are given that they're going to show up and know, oh, is this person experiencing schizophrenia? Or are they, that takes very specific training. I go back to our addiction to violence. Well, what tools do I have? If this situation gets out of hand, what tools do I have? Well, I have a gun. That will definitely stop it. And then we get what we get.
You mentioned a couple minutes ago about George Floyd was murdered and you came out with this proposal that you had lying in waiting. And you said you kind of got out ahead a little bit of the movement folks. I mean, that just says so much about your relationship with folks and your sense of kind of accountability and collaboration with community organizers and movement folks. Can you say more about sort of how do you think about getting out ahead or following from behind, or how do you work with folks?
Well, this is an area of work, and Liberty Hill plays a leading role in philanthropy, but I would love it if philanthropy would invest in studying how progressive electeds work with movement organizations. Because I think we're just figuring it out. I mean, like, we learned a lot at Cocoa when Karen got elected, but we certainly didn't learn anything. I mean, just to give you an example, Shane, Karen got elected to the California State Assembly, and people start saying, oh, she's going to run for speaker and she's going to win. Not one of us had any idea what it meant to be speaker. Like, we didn't have so we didn't even know what to ask for. You know what I mean? And so when she would come and say, like, she would expect our asks to be consistent with what she could do as speaker, except we had no idea. Like, we barely knew what it meant to be an assembly member, right? And so I think that there's a lot of that where once you're in the government, you see how it works and you have all this anxiety because you know you're on the clock. You could be thrown out at any moment, right? Literally. So you want to get things done. And then your community organization will be asking for something that is out of step with that. And so sometimes that means frustration. Sometimes that means communications break down. Sometimes that means there's lots of misunderstandings about the work. And also the other thing that happens is once you're an elected official, you quickly forget how community organizations work. You know, I'll give you an example, and this happened with traffic enforcement. I saw an organization that I'm in a line with having a meeting with a member of the council. The progressives were in a struggle with that person over something else, not related to traffic. What? Like, why didn't you ask me before? What are you doing? And then one of the things I learned was, it's like, oh, well, that was a deliverable in a grant that I had.
Oh, no.
Which, as soon as I said it, I was like, oh, yeah, that's right. Just totally how it works. Like, that's like, but I had forgotten that. Like,
oh my God.
We're doing as good a job as anybody, but I think we could do so much better.
Well, say more about that. I mean, how could we be doing better? And what is your hypothesis about how it works?
Well, I think just the coordination about understanding what's possible. I would love to hear your thoughts on it as well, because you served on the police commission. And I'll give you an example of something I say to a lot of groups that are looking for police reform. And I'm even this way on traffic. People are like, why is the traffic enforcement taking so long? I was like, well, one reason is we're about to get a new chief.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, because you were a police commissioner,
Mm-hmm.
getting a chief that's supportive of this is almost more important than anything I'm going to pass.
Yep.
I only know that because I'm inside the guy. Now that I'm inside the government, I understand, like, who's running the thing is as important as what the rules are.
Especially when it comes to policing.
Especially when it comes to policing.
Mm-hmm.
When the police chief became vacant, I'm expecting, like, oh, all the community organizations are going to rush in and be like, this is who we want as chief. That's not necessarily happening. I mean, it's happening, but not to the degree that it could. It's only if you're inside that you can see that that's happening. It's not written down anywhere. I mean, I'm sure even as a commissioner, it probably took you 6 months or a year to realize, like, oh, like, a lot of this is just what the chief says and doesn't say, right?
Yeah. And I mean, this, unlike other departments, the city council doesn't have a policy. I mean, more now with the public safety committee, but I mean,
that's right.
Really, it's the police commission that makes policy for the police department. It's not the same relationship as other departments or policy issues.
Even in the other departments, I'll never forget, I appreciate this little anecdote more now that I'm in the government. We had a member of the community coalition who was a social worker. She worked for the county. She worked in foster care. And you might remember, Shane, that we did a bunch of work around relative caregivers and
of course, yeah.
how people had to be treated and all that. And she was a COCO member. She was super supportive. And after we got our big motion passed, our big policy passed at the state, she came into the office and she said, let me show you the policy handbook. And it was a book about this thick.
Oh.
And she said, guess what happened when you passed your motion? They put another page in it.
Painful image.
She was just saying, like, what you did is great, but don't expect that it's going to change everything. She's like, you got to have a set of social workers who wanted to do this anyway. So your law lets them do that, you know, in a straight up legal way. And so that's great. But she's like, let me just tell you, most people are not thinking about that. Like, most people are thinking about completing their job, not messing up, so on and so forth. And so she said, look, at a certain point, we learned this on education reform too. Remember, we did A through G and, you know, no throwing out for willful defiance. Let me just tell you something. If you don't get to the teachers, I mean, the rules change, yes, and that helped. And I don't want to say it doesn't help. I mean, LAUSD low-income students have the highest college acceptance rate since we passed A through G.
Wow.
So that's a great thing. But if you don't have the teachers who are committed to that and have embraced it, it's just not going to happen.
Right.
And that's the way the government works. And that's something that I had no clue about before being in the government.
One of the things Alberto said in relation to the inside-outside strategies is he said, never confuse proximity and access with power. And clearly with you and Mayor Bass and all these progressive movement folks on the city council now, there's more access than we've ever had before. What is the difference between that access and real power?
Well, what I think happens is you go from playing two-dimensional chess to three-dimensional chess when you have an ally. So two-dimensional chess is I'm battling the person across the table. And when you're in a community-based organization, what's across the table is the entire establishment. So the gradations between them don't really matter that much. We want it done. When you have allies that are in the establishment, you're playing three-dimensional chess. So you're like, what is my power in relation to them? But more importantly, what is their power in relation to the person that's actually carrying out the thing? This goes back to my thing about police commission. So proximity is not the same as power, but proximity gives you the ability to understand power better. Because I will tell you, all of us thought before, if the mayor said the police had to do something and the police commission voted it, they would do it. You've been on the commission, you know, that's not how it works at all. But again, that's the three-dimensional chess that you can play once you're close enough to see it. So what proximity gets you is vision. It doesn't get you power.
And so what are some of the strategies that you can adopt once you have that proximity and that alliance?
Well, I think it is to develop a more detailed power analysis and to understand that all of these systems are public and they work in a certain way because humans are making decisions. It just may be that the humans that are making the decisions are not the ones you can see. A staffer from an office that had been there for some time, who was a friend, when I first got to City Hall, in my first week, I'm walking around, I'm looking for something. And he says, hey, let me tell you something. So what? He said, the people who really run the city, you'll never find them on the third or fourth floor. The third floor is where city council chambers and the mayor's office is. The fourth floor is where the council's office is. He's like, the people really making the trains run and the water flow and the lights come on, they're not here.
They're not even in the building. They're in some ramshackle building like a mile away.
Right. They're in a building that you can't see. And you would have to read through a couple binders to figure out who they are. And then they might take your phone call if you figure out enough to call them. But what I find happens to people, especially on the elected side, you spend 10 years later before you realize who's in charge of something. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? So it's challenging. But as an activist who has people on the inside, you can make that your work. And this is what I mean of philanthropy. Philanthropy's attention and investment in it could yield tremendous results in that regard.
Interesting idea. I might just take you up on that. So we've talked a lot about sort of inside-outside strategies in terms of policy making and implementation. But in terms of thinking about electoral power, and you did a lot of this work, voter engagement and other things when you were at COCO, and now you're on the other side of that. And the theory is, you know, if we can help get folks elected, or prevent them from getting elected or get them unelected, that gives us more power in the policy negotiations. What's the reality in your view in Los Angeles? What is the sort of power analysis about what kind of electoral strategy do you need to have to make that kind of difference?
Well, a couple things. I think local politics has been greatly democratized in Los Angeles for really two reasons, and one of them is much bigger than the other. The first one is that we moved the elections, local elections, to the even numbered years. So the same year you're voting for governor or president, you're also voting for your local school board and city council. So that's the second thing. But the other big thing is this. When I started doing a cell phone, or a smartphone to be precise, when I started doing electoral work, there were only 3 or 4 people in the whole progressive space that knew how to interact with a voter database. Now I can have the voter database in my back pocket. Mm-hmm. And I can send 25 people out to report, are they getting yeses, nos, not homes, needs more information, is a union member, and that's instantly uploaded to a database that I also can see using the same phone. So I know how many people I have precisely long before the ballot ever comes out. And that's, to me, the main reason why progressives have been able to beat. I mean, you know, you've had progressive candidates go up against the police union, the apartment owners, the developer, like all the most moneyed interest, and interest that, frankly, 10 years ago, if somebody said, all these people are against you, including labor in some instances, some parts of labor. All these people are against you. They would say, oh, then you're not viable. Well, now with this, if you got this and you got people, suddenly you are viable. And so that's why you see situations where $1 million, what did they spend against Karen Bass? $110 million.
Whoa, really?
Yeah. And then interest groups, this Thrive interest group that went after a sitting member of the council.
Yes, I wanted to ask you about that. Yes.
That member of the council was outspent 5 or 6 to 1. And not only did she won in the primary.
Woo. Yes.
But that's because you don't need $500,000 to interact with voters. You can do it relatively easily and cheaply.
Yeah. So let's talk about that in terms of a power analysis. I mean, so many of the progressive or, any community organization is focused on, elected officials, city council members as the target. But, all of a sudden Thrive comes out and it's like, okay, they're trying to recall Gascon. They're trying to kill United House LA. They're trying to take down progressive council members. It's like they're very intersectional in their view, and they're they got a little bit of public attention, but for the most part, it's sort of an invisible power base there. And how do progressive groups or movement groups get the kind of power that enables them to go toe to toe with the real targets, the real folks who are kind of pulling the strings?
Well, I would object to the premise of your question. What power do they need? They already have the power. It's not like these people are winning. It's not like they're winning. If those people were winning, we'd have Ethan or Evan, whatever his name is, Rick Caruso, Mitch O'Farrell, Gil Cedillo. It would be a very different makeup.
Yeah. And United House LA would be dead.
Right. And there would be no ULA. A lot of the things that we have wouldn't have happened. So I think the power is already there. I just think folks have to decide how and when they want to use it and deploy it and move from there.
And if you were advising them on how and when to deploy it, what would you say?
Look, I think pick winnable races and go after it. There's a lot of people on the council now where the people who you and I learned electoral work from would have said those people weren't viable.
Mm-hmm. And they did.
And their time, they weren't viable. Times are different now.
Right.
I don't tell any of my colleagues, look, if you can make an alliance with the people who are in Thrive, if you can figure out how to get along with them, great. Do that. But also don't think if you can't, that means you have to pack your bag and go home. We've demonstrated that that's not the case. Sam Yebri, that's the other person.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Things have changed. In the 90s and the 2000s, the aughts, I guess they were called.
Yes.
If labor, business, and environmentalists were against you, you could not win. If one of those groups was against you and the other two just weren't on your side, you couldn't win. The other two were neutral on you. Right? Say the environmentalists are neutral and labor's neutral on you and developers are neutral, but the apartment owners are really against you, you probably would have lost. That's not true anymore.
Would you say those are still the big three power groups?
I mean, those are the most organized, well-financed.
Mm-hmm.
Still, there's still nothing as big as, unless you get a billionaire, there's still nothing as big as labor in terms of money and people.
Mm-hmm.
But, labor less and less rolls all together. In the council races that are happening now, you have some labor with one person, some labor with another person. That was true in the Nithya Raman race, but nobody matches them. And then, these other interest groups, they have money to spend.
And in a time like this, where we have a, historic presidential election coming up, understandably and rightly, attention gets shifted and focused to national elections. So what would you say about why is Los Angeles important now, even though, there's so much power at the federal level? Why invest in Los Angeles? Why care about LA politics?
Look, Los Angeles is the holy hotspot. It is the conductor, attractor for social justice. It is by far the most dynamic and inclusive civic experiment anywhere in the United States. This is the city where $15 an hour happened first. The big city that has a big alternative to traffic enforcement. This is the city that put an African-American woman in the mayor's office against a billionaire who dropped $110 million and was joined by the police and fire unions. There's no replacement for Los Angeles in the context of the United States. If there can be progressive movement in this country, 80% of the time it starts in LA.
And that's one of the themes that's come up in this season's podcast is from a number of folks, all of whom Manuel Pastor, Anthony Thigpen, Peter Dreyer, Mike Bonin. They're all talking about how, as progressive and powerful as we are now, that's really in our in our adulthood, we've seen that shift from the 90s to now. It was not always like that. And so there is this sense that we can't take it for granted. Why do you think we're more progressive now? And how do we continue to shape that electorate so it continues to move in the right direction, doesn't get taken back?
The reason why we are strong and we stay strong is we built the infrastructure. So, you take a foundation like Liberty Hill. Liberty Hill's helped build the infrastructure for organizations like Community Coalition. Community Coalition helps build the infrastructure for organizations like A New Way of Life. A New Way of Life helps build the motion to get ban the box motion passed in the state and to get voting rights. We now have a piece of legislation on the table in Sacramento that would give the voting rights to people the minute they leave prison, even if they're on probation. But all of that is because we have the infrastructure to support it. And if you build the infrastructure, Los Angeles is the kind of great place that attracts the talent. People are going to step into it. You and I, Shane, have known each other a long time. We've been working it. And out of nowhere pops some guy named Isaac Bryan, right? You know what I mean? So that's the sauce Los Angeles has.
Yes.
None of us, I didn't know where the guy came. I didn't know anything about him, but he just comes and he's ready to throw down. What I mean by infrastructure is he comes, he's very talented and he's ready to throw down. There's a platform for him that was built before he got there.
Right.
And so we got to build, maintain, and expand the platforms.
Love it. For our production team, everything Marqueece just said about infrastructure, that is actually the center point of our entire new strategic plan, is really Liberty Hill investing in our infrastructure so that can be greater infrastructure for movements, and not just movement infrastructure, but also the infrastructure to implement government programs like social housing or Stay Housed LA.
Exactly.
Well, we have to wrap up, but I would love to hear sort of call to action for our listeners, their donors, their voters, their organizers. In this election year, with so much at stake, what would your call to action be?
Well, my call to action, look, we're in a flow. We'll be in a flow for the rest of the year. Whatever your thing is, get 10 toes down, dig in. Your work in this next time period will produce much more because of the environment and the context that we're in than probably any other time in recent history. And so I just say, everybody, again, put your head down, 10 toes down, whatever is your thing. I'm not asking you to change your thing, but whatever your thing is, make the deepest investments you can make, work as hard as you can possibly work, dream as big as you can possibly dream, because we are in a fertile season for justice and building the kind of world that we all deserve to live in.
Oof, thank you for that. All right, my final question before we wrap up is a fun one. What is your favorite Los Angeles landmark or place to visit?
The South Korean Friendship Bell in San Pedro near a place called Liberty Hill.
Yes. And why is that your favorite?
It stands alone right there on the bluff. And so it's one of the few things in Los Angeles that you can see by itself with the backdrop of the ocean. It is very peaceful and meditative, even though it's a public park. You feel peaceful by it. And I like what it represents, because at the moment that the South Korean government gifted that bell to the city of Los Angeles, both entities were coming into their own. Los Angeles was becoming a major world center, which is why South Korea wanted a relationship. And South Korea was becoming a first world economy and one of the major manufacturing centers in the world. I mean, people forget in the 1970s, South Korea and Mexico had basically the same economy and the same standard of living. South Korea performed a miracle between then and now. And I think Los Angeles has performed miracles between then and now, and we have plenty to go. So it screams possibility and serenity all at once.
Whew. Well, on that note, thank you, Council President Pro Tem Marqueece Harris-Dawson, and thank you to everyone who joined us today for the third season of Conversations from the Front Lines. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a comment, and share this podcast with a friend who's interested in learning more about the fight for social justice.